She stood at the gate with a dress too thin for the wind and eyes too wide for the world. "Please don't leave me like Mama did," she whispered, and the words cut straight through the cold. Amos and Ruth Whitlock had buried their only child last winter, and now a new child stood on their doorstep. They opened the door. The wind howled that evening, a mean, lonely sound that rattled the porch lantern and scraped tree branches against the roof. But inside the quiet farmhouse, Amos and Ruth Whitlock didn't move. They just sat. Her knitting was a forgotten pile in her lap. His eyes were fixed on the dark horizon, as if he was waiting for something more than the same old stars to show up. It had been like this for months, a silence so heavy it felt like a third person in the room. It was Ruth who saw her first, a flicker of movement just past the picket fence, a small shape, barely there in the gloom. The girl stood perfectly still, like she was afraid one more step might shatter her into 1,000 pieces. Amos didn't see the girl. He felt the change first. The crickets went silent. The wind seemed to hold its breath, but the porch lantern still swayed in the sudden, awful hush. It was the same kind of quiet that always fell right before a bad memory decided to claw its way back to life. He turned his head slowly and his breath hitched in his chest. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, but she was thin in that way that makes age impossible to guess. Her dress was a faded blue rag, torn at the hem. Her boots were caked in mud and split open at the toes. A single dark braid hung over her shoulder, streaked with the dust of a long, hard road. But it was her eyes that made Ruth get up without thinking. They were wide, silent, and tired in a way no child's eyes should ever be. Ruth stepped off the porch, her own boots making no sound on the damp earth. "You lost, sweetheart?" she asked. Her voice was careful, gentle, as if anything louder might scare the little creature off. The child just blinked. Then she took a step forward. Not scared, not brave, just decided. When she spoke, her voice was a dry crackle, like old wood. "Please don't leave me like Mama did." Ruth was on her knees in an instant. "Oh, honey." She looked back at Amos, but he was already moving, rising from his chair like the weight of his own bones had just doubled. The girl didn't cry, not a single tear. She just stood there, a thing left behind by a storm, a piece of wreckage the wind forgot to finish off. "What's your name, child?" Amos asked when he reached the gate, his voice rough with disuse. "Willa," she said. "Willa James." Ruth didn't ask about her mother. The answer was already there in the way the girl's hands trembled, in the way she clutched a frayed canvas satchel like it was the only thing left in the world that was hers. "Come on," Ruth said, reaching for her hand. "It's cold. You'll catch your death." Amos opened the gate, and Willa walked through. She didn't need to be led. Inside, the house smelled of pine and old memories. Amos stoked the fire, coaxing it from embers to a proper blaze. Ruth brought Willa a blanket, soft and faded, and a cup of warm milk with a spoonful of honey. Willa took it with both hands, cradling the warmth, and sat by the hearth. She didn't say a word. Amos watched her from the doorway. "Where'd you come from, Willa?" She didn't look up right away. Ruth touched his arm. "Let her be." But then Willa spoke, her voice quieter than the fire. "Mama told me to run. She said if I heard men's voices, to run and not stop. I waited by the river, like she told me to. But she never came back." Amos closed his eyes. The world was full of men's voices, and none of them were good. "Was it just you and her?" Ruth asked softly. Willa nodded. "We moved a lot, looking for someone. She had a name in her pocket, a man's name, Jonah Price. He was supposed to help us, but she said we were too late." Her brow furrowed, trying to remember something that hurt. "She said this place was kind. She said the people here were good." Later, after Willa had fallen asleep in the rocking chair, cocooned in the old blanket, Amos stood by the window. The stars were out now, cold and sharp. "She doesn't know she's truly alone yet," he said. "She will," Ruth whispered from behind him. "And when she does, it'll be the second time she's lost everything. Maybe, maybe we can stop it from happening a third." Amos turned. "You thinking what I'm thinking, Ruth?" "I'm thinking the Lord doesn't put a lost child on your doorstep by accident." He stared at the little canvas satchel leaning against the chair. He knelt down and gently opened the flap. Inside, there were only three things: a broken comb, a small, worn leather Bible, and a torn piece of paper with that name written in a desperate, elegant script. Jonah Price. He handed the paper to Ruth. "You know the name?" She shook her head. "But someone in town might." Willa stirred in her sleep, her face crumpling for a moment, but no tears came. She just curled tighter, as if trying to make herself smaller. Amos sighed, a deep, heavy sound that came from the same place as the morning they buried their son, Isaac, under the big cottonwood tree. "We lost ours," he said quietly. "Maybe the Lord's given us someone else to care for." "She's not a replacement, Amos." "I know," he said, his gaze fixed on the sleeping girl. "But maybe she's a reason." The next morning, Willa was already awake when they came into the kitchen. She sat at the table, her legs swinging, a piece of cornbread in her hand. Her eyes held a practiced quiet, the look of a child who had learned not to be a bother. Ruth put a plate of eggs in front of her. "Eat up. You're no trouble here." Willa looked down at the plate, as if the kindness stung. "Mama used to say that," she whispered, "when we had food." The air went still. Amos broke the silence, stepping in from the cold. "Going to town. You want to come, Willa?" She looked up, surprised. "Why?" "To see the place," he shrugged. "Help me carry some flour." She hesitated, then gave a single, small nod. "I'll go." The trip was quiet. Amos didn't push her to talk, but he saw the way her eyes darted everywhere, taking in the worn signs, the tired horses, the faces in the windows. She stood close to him in the general store, her fingers sometimes brushing his coat, a child not sure if she was allowed to hold on. At the post office, Amos showed the clerk the slip of paper. The clerk squinted at the name. "Jonah Price. Ain't heard that name in a long, long time." "He dead?" Amos asked. The man shook his head. "Nah. Left before the war. Had some trouble. Debts, I think. Heard he had a woman, too. Left her behind. Broke her heart, from what I recall. Headed west." Willa's face didn't change, but something in her went still. On the ride home, she finally spoke. "You don't have to keep me. I can go." Amos pulled the wagon to a stop. "And where would you go, Willa?" She shrugged, a hollow gesture. "Mama always found somewhere." "You're not your mama," Amos said, his voice firm but not unkind. "And this isn't just somewhere. This is a home." "What if you change your mind?" she whispered. He looked out over the barren fields, then down at her small, worried face. "I buried my only son last winter. I hadn't prayed for a single thing since. Then you showed up at my gate. You're not something I give up on easy." She didn't cry, but her hand found his, and this time she held on tight. The days that followed fell into a quiet routine, the kind that almost makes you forget that things were ever broken. Willow was a ghost in the house, sweeping without being asked, folding her blanket perfectly each morning. She moved like someone who was always ready to be told to leave. Her few belongings never left her satchel, which she kept by the hearth, ready to run. Ruth tried to reach her with small kindnesses, a ribbon for her hair, a story before bed. Willa listened, always polite, but her eyes stayed locked up tight. One evening, Ruth found her standing out by the cottonwood tree where their son Isaac was buried. "You knew him?" Willa asked without turning around. "I knew him every day of his life," Ruth said softly. "I never knew mine." The wind whispered through the grass. "He was about your age," Ruth said, the old ache in her chest. "Loved this tree. Said it was his guardian." "Does it guard you too?" Willa asked, looking up at the bare branches. Ruth felt the sting of tears but didn't let them fall. "I think it does." That night, a piece of paper was left on Ruth's pillow. It was a clumsy sketch of the cottonwood tree, and underneath it, a tiny figure holding a ribbon. But peace like that is a fragile thing. A week later, they went to town for supplies. Willa wore a clean dress Ruth had mended for her, and folks noticed. The whispers started. A thin, stooped man named George Petty watched them from the back of the store. His eyes narrowed. "Don't look nothing like you," he muttered as Amos passed. Amos ignored him, but he didn't forget the look on Petty's face. On the ride home, Willa was quiet. "Do people not like me?" she finally asked. "People don't like what they don't understand," Amos said. Will they make me leave? No, Willa, he said, his voice hard as iron. They won't. That night, Ruth saw a figure watching the house from beyond the barn. It was too far to see a face, but it was deliberate. The shape vanished when she stepped onto the porch. Amos came out a moment later, the shotgun already in his hand. Petty, he muttered, or one of his kind. They didn't sleep much that night. The next day, Amos rode to see the sheriff, Kellen Hart. Kellen was a hard man, but a fair one. She a runaway? Kellen asked after hearing the story. Her ma's gone, Amos said. Told her to run, and she ran straight to us. Kellen nodded slowly. Petty's been talking, spreading stories. He says there's a bounty out west for a woman and a child. He slid a dusty, crumpled handbill across his desk. It was a rough sketch of a woman, underneath a reward of $80. But the name listed wasn't Willa's mother. It was a name they'd never seen before. Abigail Rowe. Doesn't mean it's her, Amos said, his heart pounding. No, Kellen agreed. But rumors don't care about the truth, and $80 is a lot of money to a desperate man. Amos rode home with a cold knot in his stomach, but the trouble was already waiting for him. Tucked under the porch rail was a single folded sheet of paper. No name, no signature, just 5 words scrawled in angry ink. She belongs to me. I'm coming. Amos told Ruth he burned the letter. He didn't. He kept it tucked in his coat. He saw something on the back of the paper, a faint indentation from whatever was written on the page above it. It wasn't a word. It was a symbol, like a brand for cattle, a strange curling shape with a cross in the middle. Willa saw the smoke from the stove, but she didn't ask. That night she didn't just sleep with her shoes on. She locked her satchel under her bed. The next week was a held breath. Every shadow was a threat. Willa knew someone was coming. She'd learned the signs of danger in the twitch of a man's jaw, in the whispers of adults who thought she was asleep. One morning, Amos was hitching the wagon. You leaving? She asked, her voice small. Just to town, he said. Won't be long. Can I come? He hesitated. Not today, Willa. Her face didn't fall. It just went empty. She nodded once and went inside. Ruth found her by the fire, tracing words in her little Bible she couldn't read. Amos will be back, Ruth said gently. So did Mama, Willa whispered to the flames. Once. But Amos didn't go to the general store. He went to a rundown shack at the edge of town with a sign that read, Rook's Claims and Loans. Inside, a man with a scarred face named Denton Rook looked up from a ledger. You got a problem, Whitlock? Amos laid the threatening letter on the counter. Rook read it and smirked. That's your girl? She's not property. Then why's someone writing you about her? Amos ignored the question and laid the crumpled bounty flyer next to the letter. Then he took out a piece of paper where he'd traced the strange brand. I want to know who uses this mark, and I want to know who wrote this letter. Rook's smirk vanished when he saw the brand. He went pale. That's Judge Myron Beckett's mark, from the Texas territory. He ain't some common bounty man, Whitlock. He don't buy property. He buys people. And the letter? Amos pressed. Rook leaned in, his voice a low whisper. The man you're looking for is Jasper Flynn, ex-Pinkerton. He works for Beckett, and if he's coming, he's not coming to talk. Back at the farm, the sky was turning dark. Willa was sitting with Ruth by the clothesline. Mama said the world punishes kindness, Willa said suddenly. Do you believe that? Ruth asked. I don't want to. Then don't, Ruth said. The world is cruel, but that doesn't mean we have to be. Just then, thunder rumbled in the distance, and Ruth saw it, a shape moving near the tree line. Too deliberate to be an animal, too patient to be a neighbor. Willa, she said, her voice tight. Inside. Now. The girl didn't ask why. She ran. Amos returned as the first drops of rain began to fall. They're here, Ruth said the moment he stepped inside. He nodded, his face grim. I know. His name is Flynn. Willa stood behind the door, her face a white mask of fear. Who is he? He's a man who works for a judge named Beckett, Amos said, his voice low and steady. And they think you're property. I'm not worth anything, she whispered. Ruth knelt in front of her. You hear me? You are not for sale. You never were. They barred the doors. They loaded the shotgun. They waited as the storm broke over the house, a furious symphony of wind and rain. The knock came just after midnight. It wasn't a real knock. It was a test. 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more. A voice called through the splintering wood. Mr. Whitlock, I'm here on behalf of the rightful guardian of the girl, Judge Beckett. She has no guardian but God, Amos yelled back. A low chuckle answered him. Paper says different. I've seen the paper and I've seen the girl, Amos said. I choose the girl. There was a moment of silence. Then, that's a poor choice, friend. A boot slammed against the door. Then another. Wood screamed and splintered. The door didn't break all at once. The crossbeam Amos had nailed across it held for a moment, groaning under the assault. Willa huddled in the back room, clutching her little Bible, listening to the wood splinter, listening to Amos's steady breathing, listening to Ruth whispering a prayer. Then the door exploded inward. A man stepped through the shattered frame, tall and broad, his coat soaked with rain. Another man, thinner and nervous, followed behind him. They were wolves, not farmers. Amos didn't lower the shotgun. You Flynn? The big man smirked, water dripping from the brim of his hat. That's me. We're not here to hurt anyone, just collecting what's owed. She's not yours to collect. Flynn shrugged, stepping further into the room. The paper says otherwise. Signed and sealed by Judge Myron Beckett. Her ma was under contract. That makes the girl his property. She's a child, Ruth cried out. Didn't say she wasn't property, Flynn said without looking at her. Then his eyes locked on Amos. I know your type. Bible in one hand, shotgun in the other. Think you're righteous. Let me tell you, old man, nothing is fair. Your boy died. A shame. But this girl ain't yours to keep in his place. Amos's jaw tightened. Her name is Willa, and she is not for sale. Flynn took a step forward. You willing to die for a girl you barely know? Suddenly, Flynn's smirk widened. You know what? The judge told me something interesting. Said the girl might be more than just property. Said she might carry his blood. The room went cold. Ruth gasped. Amos stared, the shotgun unwavering. Flynn laughed. That's right. You might be harboring the judge's own kin. Now, are you going to give her to me? Or do we have to tear this place apart? You take one more step, Amos said, his voice a low growl, and you'll find out. The air crackled. Flynn stared at him. Then, unbelievably, he laughed in turn. For now, he said over his shoulder, this isn't over. You made this harder than it needed to be. Now it's going to cost you. He stepped back out into the storm, his partner scrambling after him. Amos stood frozen, the gun still raised, his heart hammering against his ribs. They didn't sleep. The storm passed, but the silence it left behind was worse. At sunrise, Sheriff Kellen rode out with 2 deputies. He took one look at the shattered door and swore. Amos told him everything. The brand, Judge Beckett, Jasper Flynn, and the terrible claim that Willa was Beckett's own blood. Kellen's face went hard. I've seen that brand before, he said, his voice grim. During the war, on prisoners of a private camp run by a man they called the Judge. He wasn't a real judge then, either. This was older and darker than a simple bounty. He'll be back, Amos said. Then I'll be back too, Kellen promised. Before he left, he knelt in front of Willa. You remember anything about this man? This Beckett? She shook her head, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. Mama never let me near him. She just said he was a bad man. She said we had to run. The next few days were a blur of tense quiet. Ruth patched the door. Amos walked the perimeter of the farm, his hand never far from his gun. Willa tried to draw, but her pictures were all sharp edges and dark shadows. She started a sketch of the cottonwood tree, but tore it up in frustration. If I draw it wrong, she whispered to Ruth, it won't be real. Sweetheart, Ruth said, it's already real. We're here. That night at dinner, Willa looked at Amos. If he comes back, if he hurts you, it will be my fault. Amos put down his fork. Listen to me, Willa. You are not a burden, you are not a mistake, and you are not to blame for what evil men do. Then why do they keep coming for me? She cried, her voice breaking. Because light draws moths, he said softly, and some moths would burn down the whole world just to feel warm for a second. The second attack came without a sound. It was just before dawn, in the gray, colorless light. Amos was in the barn. Ruth was at the stove. Willa opened the back door to empty a basin of water and froze. A shape stood in the trees. Too tall, too still, a glint of metal. A hand clamped over her mouth from behind. She bit down, hard. The man cursed and his grip loosened. She dropped the basin and scrambled away, screaming one word. Amos! Another man was coming from the trees, and a third from the side of the barn. They were trying to set it on fire to smoke them out. Amos came running, the shotgun roaring to life. One man dropped. The others scattered into the woods. Kellen and his deputies arrived within the hour. The dead man was George Petty, the whisperer from the general store. In his pocket was a handful of coins and a note from Flynn. They buried him without a prayer. That night, Willa sat by the window. I thought I was safe here, she whispered. You are, Ruth insisted. No. Safe means no one comes. Safe means I can sleep. She turned from the window to look at Amos. How many times will you stand for me before you change your mind? Amos knelt beside her. There's no number that breaks love, Willa. For the first time, she believed him. The next day, a writer brought a letter. It wasn't a threat this time. It was a legal document, an invitation. To the parties harboring Willa James. You have 30 days to present her at the estate of Judge Myron Beckett in Crows Hollow, Texas, to resolve this matter legally. Failure to comply will result in further action. He's trying to put a coat and tie on a kidnapping, Kellen said, reading it over. What do we do? Ruth asked, her voice trembling. Amos stared out the window, toward the cottonwood tree where his son lay. We go, he said. We finish this. They left at dawn, 3 loaves of bread, 2 jars of beans, ammunition, and Isaac's old blanket. Willa brought her satchel, but she also brought something new, a sliver of hope. Kellen had offered to ride with them, but Amos refused. 3 makes a family, he said. More than that makes it a war. Still, Kellen pressed a note into his hand. Sheriff Prout in Crow's Hollow. He's a good man. Find him if you find trouble. The trail south was long and mean. They were stalked. One night, a rock slide nearly sent their wagon into a ravine. It wasn't an accident. They found fresh boot prints at the top of the ridge. Another day, they came across a traveling preacher who saw the terror in Willa's eyes. When Amos described the brand, the preacher crossed himself. Judge Beckett, he whispered. They say he collects souls. They say he believes he is above God. Willa started having nightmares, not just of running, but of a big white house with tall columns, a man's cruel voice echoing in a long hallway. Memories that weren't hers. Or were they? Crow's Hollow was a dusty scar on the earth, and on the edge of it sat Beckett's estate, a white mansion that looked down on the town like a king on his throne. Armed guards stood at the gate. Amos found Sheriff Prout in a small, dusty office. Prout was a tired man with honest eyes. He read Kellen's letter and sighed. Beckett doesn't make deal, he said. He owns them. He uses paper the way other men use pistols. To challenge him, you'll need more than good intentions. He sent men to our home, Ruth said. They tried to take her. I believe you, Prout said, looking at Willa. But in this town, belief doesn't hold up in court. You need proof. He told them to stay at the church. Father Thomas is a good man. Beckett won't touch you on holy ground. That night, Amos went looking for a weakness. He found a man named Jonas Karn, a former writer for Beckett, drowning his ghosts in a saloon. Amos approached him carefully. I'm not looking for trouble, just the truth about Judge Beckett. Karn laughed, a bitter, broken sound. The truth is trouble where Beckett's concerned. He wants a child, a girl named Willa. Karn sobered instantly. Nora's girl. I knew her mother, Nora. She was trapped, forced into a labor contract to pay off a debt that wasn't hers. Beckett forged the papers himself. No judge ever signed it. Would you swear to that? Amos asked, his heart pounding. Karn hesitated. Not without protection. You'll have it. Meet me at the church steps at dawn. But dawn came, and Jonas Karn didn't. They found his body hanging from a tree just outside of town. Pinned to his shirt was a note. Next one dies slower. The town was gripped with fear. People who had smiled at them the day before now crossed the street to avoid them. They were a curse. They had brought the devil to Crow's Hollow. People don't care about the truth here, Willa said, her voice flat. They care, Ruth said, but they care about safety more. What if there's no such thing as safe? Willa whispered. Amos knelt in front of her. Then we make it anyway. That night, Willa couldn't sleep. She wandered into the empty chapel, the moonlight streaming through the stained glass windows. She felt a strange pull toward the old leather Bible she always carried. It had been her mother's. She ran her fingers over the worn cover. There was a slight bulge near the spine. Her nail caught on a loose piece of leather. It wasn't a tear. It was a seam. With trembling fingers, she peeled it back. Underneath was a hidden compartment, hollowed out of the thick cover. And inside were two folded, yellowed pieces of paper. The first was a marriage certificate between Nora James and Jonah Price. The second was a birth certificate for Willa James. And under the line for father, it listed his name again. Jonah Price. She wasn't Beckett's blood. She wasn't a debt. She was someone's daughter. But there was one more thing tucked inside, a land deed, a claim for 100 acres of land right outside Crow's Hollow. The land that Judge Beckett's pristine white mansion was currently sitting on. The deed was in Jonah Price's name. It was never about her. It was about the land. She wasn't the property. She was the rightful owner, and Beckett knew it. The hearing was set for the next day. In the chapel, Beckett agreed too quickly. It was a trap. The church filled with townspeople, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Beckett arrived in a black carriage flanked by Jasper Flynn and 10 armed men. The hearing began. Beckett rose, cool and confident. The child's mother entered a contractual bond. That bond extends to her offspring. The girl is legally mine. Sheriff Prout stood. No such contract exists in our registry. The document you hold is a forgery. Flynn sneered. The paper is law. Then Willa stood up. The entire church went silent. My name is Willa James, she said, her voice clear and strong. My mother didn't run from a debt. She ran from a thief. She held up the birth certificate. I am the daughter of Jonah Price. Then she held up the land deed. And this is his land. The land your house is built on, Judge Beckett. You didn't come for me. You came to silence me, to bury the truth. The room erupted. Beckett's face was a thundercloud of fury. He gave Flynn a nod. Flynn reached into his coat. He wasn't pulling out papers. He was pulling out a gun. But Amos was faster. He tackled Flynn, sending them both crashing to the floor. The gun went off, the shot echoing through the chapel like a crack of doom. Smoke filled the air. People screamed. Ruth pulled Willa down behind a pew. Sheriff Prout's own gun fired once. Flynn dropped. Amos stood up, bleeding from a gash on his arm, but alive. Beckett stood frozen, his hands raised. His mask of control finally shattered. It's over, Judge, Prout said, snapping handcuffs onto his wrists. You're under arrest. The chapel fell quiet, the air thick with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. Flynn lay motionless on the floor. Beckett was led away in chains, the townspeople parting in stunned silence. Amos sagged onto a pew, clutching his bleeding arm. Willa rushed to his side. You're hurt. I've had worse, he managed, but his face was pale. Ruth was already there, pressing a handkerchief to the wound. It went clean through, she said, her voice steady. Tears streamed down Willa's face. She hadn't cried when she arrived at their gate, a lost and broken thing. But she cried now. For him. For them. You saved me, she whispered, wrapping her arms around his neck. We stood with you, Amos corrected her gently. That's what family does. Ruth stood and faced the remaining crowd. You all saw what happened. That man, she pointed to Flynn's body, came for a child with a gun. The other, her voice trembled slightly, came with a paper he thought made him God. But we answered them with truth. One by one, The people nodded and filed out into the sunlight, the heavy weight of fear finally beginning to lift from the town of Crow's Hollow. The fight was over, but the war for peace had just begun. News of Beckett's arrest spread, but his influence lingered like a poison. The first sign was a missing rooster from the church coop. Then a fence post on the edge of town was found snapped in two. Small things, accidents maybe. But when Father Thomas found the chapel's bell rope cut clean through, Amos knew. He went to see Prout. "He's still got men out there," Amos said. Prout nodded grimly. "Word is he's embarrassed. A cornered animal is a dangerous one. He's not after the girl's land anymore. He's after revenge." In the town's fear, which had receded, began to creep back in. Rumors started that the Whitlocks had brought this trouble, that keeping Willa was a danger to everyone. People started looking away again. The smiles vanished. "They think I'm the problem again," Willa said one evening, her voice barely a whisper. "No," Ruth said. "They're just remembering their fear. It doesn't make them right." "But what if it never stops?" she asked Amos, her eyes wide. "What if there's always someone chasing me?" Amos looked her straight in the eye. "Then we keep standing until they get tired of falling down." That night, a dry storm lit up the sky with silent flashes of lightning. Willa couldn't sleep. She walked barefoot into the dark chapel. The cut bell rope was coiled in a basket. She stared up at the silent bell. "Please," she whispered into the cavernous space, "ring for me just once, so I know I still matter." The bell didn't move, but the chapel door creaked open behind her. She spun around. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway. He was thin, haunted, not one of Beckett's thugs. "You're Willa," he said. It wasn't a question. "Who are you?" She backed away. "Someone who made a mistake," he said, stepping into the light. "I used to ride with Beckett. I helped him run your father, Jonah, off his land. I helped track your mother." Willa froze. "You're lying." "I wish I was," he said. His eyes were filled with a deep, old regret. "But I left him. I've been running ever since. Your mother, before she ran the last time, she found me. She made me swear that if I ever saw you, I'd give you this." He pulled a folded, worn note from his coat. He set it on a pew and turned to leave. "She loved you," he said. "She died trying to keep you free." And then he was gone, swallowed by the storm. Willa picked up the note. Her mother's looping scrawl filled the page. "I'm sorry I was afraid. I'm sorry I couldn't stay. But if you find good people, real ones, you stay. You love them. You let them love you back. That's how you win. Not by running, but by hoping." Tears streamed down her face. She folded the note and held it to her chest. Then she turned and ran for the bell tower. The rope was cut, but she didn't care. She climbed the ladder, squeezed through the hatch, and grabbed the heavy iron clapper with both hands. She pulled with all her might. The bell rang. Once. Twice. The sound rolled out over the sleeping town like thunder. Amos and Ruth bolted upright in bed. Lights flickered on in houses down the street. Doors opened. The chapel bell kept ringing, wild and broken, but loud and clear and insistent. Alive. From the top of the tower, Willa shouted into the wind, "I'm not running anymore." By morning, the town had gathered at the chapel. Willa stood before them, her mother's note tucked safely in her Bible. "My mother ran," she told them, "but I won't. I'm not asking you to fight for me, but I'm going to fight for myself. And if you'll stand with me, I'll never forget it." There was a long silence. Then the old storekeeper stepped forward. "That girl rang the bell when no one else dared." Another man spoke up. "She made the judge flinch." And another, "She's one of us now. Let them come." By sundown, the town had become a fortress. They were ready. The final day dawned gray and quiet. Word came from a trader. Beckett's men were riding. 10 of them. They weren't coming for a legal fight. They were coming for blood. The town square filled not with a mob, but with a community. Farmers with hunting rifles, blacksmiths with hammers. Father Thomas stood on the chapel steps, a Bible in one hand and an old pistol in the other. Willa stood beside him with Amos and Ruth at her back. The riders appeared at the edge of town, a slow, arrogant procession. and from a wagon in the center stepped Judge Beckett. He'd been released, his money and influence buying his freedom for now. "This gathering is not legal," he boomed. "Then why'd you bring an army?" Amos called back. Beckett's cold eyes landed on Willa. "You've caused a lot of trouble, girl. You'll never be safe." Willa stepped forward, her voice ringing out across the square. "Maybe not, but I won't be silent." Beckett took a step toward her, and that's when a bell rang. Loud and sharp. Not the big bell in the tower, a smaller one Ruth had hung inside the chapel. A signal. At the sound, dozens of men and women stepped out from behind wagons and doorways, raising their weapons. Not to fire, just to show they were there, that they were standing together. Beckett's men shifted, suddenly uneasy. Sheriff Prout leveled his shotgun. "You take one more step, Beckett, and you'll leave this town in a pine box. Your choice." Beckett stared at the wall of determined faces. At the girl who wouldn't run. At the family that wouldn't break. He saw his power was gone. Here in this dusty town, his name was just a name. He turned without another word. "Mount up," he barked. Within minutes they were gone, leaving nothing behind but dust and a silence that, for the first time, felt like peace. A week later they rode home. The homestead was just as they'd left it, the cottonwood tree standing guard. But the house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt alive. That evening by the fire, Willa looked into the flames. What if someone else comes someday? Amos sipped his tea. Then we'll be here. Ruth reached across and took her hand. "We stay," she said softly. "That's what love is, Willa. The part that stays." Willa nodded. She went to her satchel and took out a small, blank journal she'd bought in Crow's Hollow. She opened it to the first page and began to write. "My name is Willa James Whitlock. This is the story of how I stopped being afraid, and how I found a home." Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwood leaves, and for the first time in a very long time, the girl slept through the entire night. If you enjoyed this story of courage and found family, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more tales of the strange and the inspiring.